We can't claim we haven't been warned. In 1995, Muslim rebels from Chechnya directed a TV reporter to a park in central Moscow. The package she found contained a small amount of explosives and something else. Cesium-137, a radioactive isotope. This was the first known appearance of what has become a household word, a dirty bomb.
An unfolding terrorist plot to attack the United States by exploding a radioactive dirty bomb.
The so-called dirty bomb is basically just a conventional explosive with a radioactive core to it. You're going to broadcast the radioactivity over the area of the conventional explosive. In Al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan, there were discovered a number of documents dealing with the methodology of putting together the most deadly kind of dirty bomb imaginable.
What would happen if terrorists were to explode a dirty bomb in the center of a major city?
Typical wind speed is about 10 kilometers an hour, and that's roughly how quickly particles are going to move.
Just blocks away, people would go about their business unaware of the real danger. Invisible and odorless, floating on the wind.
Radioactive material will be deposited on the ground, inside of buildings, on cars that might move around, on people's clothing.
For anyone who remains in the area, any health effects could take decades to appear.
Up to about 200 meters from the blast, if the area were not decontaminated, the risk of cancer would increase by 1 in 10. Now, the Environmental Protection Agency mandates that contaminated areas be cleaned up so that there is a risk of at most 1 in 10,000. I imagine that there would be a very strong debate in the aftermath of a radiological terrorist attack to determine what area would have to be decontaminated.
Is it a block, 2 blocks, 5 blocks, 10 blocks? At what point do people, even if the government says they are safe, do they feel that it's safe to return?
Mass destruction or mass disruption? How much of a threat does a dirty bomb really pose?
It seems ridiculous to think that we might demolish or abandon chunks of a city, but in some cases that will become our preferred approach.
We know terrorists can destroy our buildings. With a dirty bomb, could they force us to do it? Dirty Bomb, up next on Nova.
Major funding for Nova is provided by the Park Foundation, dedicated to education and quality television.
We see 400 employees in 3 years. At Microsoft, your potential inspires us to create software that helps you reach it. Your potential, our passion.
Science. It's given us the framework to help make wireless communications clear. Sprint is proud to support Nova.
And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
The dirty bomb is perhaps the least understood of all terrorist weapons. We have all heard of it, but few of us know what it would do, or what it wouldn't. It's often called the poor man's nuclear weapon, but that's misleading.
A dirty bomb is not a nuclear weapon, but it is a real threat. It is a weapon that could wreak havoc in ways far beyond its physical consequences, and that makes it an ideal terrorist weapon.
The aim of a real nuclear bomb is mass destruction. Just one can destroy an entire city, as the world saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. It took enormous scientific expertise as well as specially refined uranium and plutonium for the U.S. to build these early bombs. Only a handful of countries have managed to follow suit. A nuclear bomb is still difficult and expensive to build, but a dirty bomb is not.
In many ways it is low-tech, and that is one of the most concerning things. The dirty bomb really is not a major technical challenge.
That's because a dirty bomb is just ordinary explosives, mixed with something radioactive.
There is no technological secret to making a dirty bomb. It just requires the knowledge of making a conventional bomb. All you need to do to make it a dirty bomb is to add some kind of radioactive material.
The technical term for a dirty bomb is radiological dispersal device. It disperses radioactivity. Invisible, frightening, and misunderstood.
There are many reasons why people are frightened of radiation. We know it's very harmful, and yet we can't see it, we can't smell it, and we can't feel it.
For terrorists, it is that fear of radiation that makes a dirty bomb so attractive. In the spring of 2002, the word dirty bomb burst into headlines around the world.
We have disrupted an unfolding terrorist plot to attack the United States by exploding a radioactive dirty bomb.
Jose Padilla is an American citizen, a former Latino gang member who converted to Islam and joined Al-Qaeda.
Jose Padilla apparently went to Al-Qaeda and said, "Look, give me some money and I'll carry out an operation for you, including a dirty bomb." Al-Qaeda said, "Okay, fine," and they gave him $10,000. It was one of the kinds of operations that Al-Qaeda has been known for in the past, kind of a venture capital seeding operation.
The FBI received a tip-off from a captured Al-Qaeda member and was waiting when Jose Padilla landed in Chicago carrying $10,000 in cash. Accused of being an enemy combatant, Padilla was placed in a Navy brig without trial. No evidence against him has been presented in court. Some question whether Padilla did more than talk about dirty bombs. But there is other evidence that Al-Qaeda is getting ready to act. In the fall of 2001, as American-led forces took control of Afghanistan, a discovery was made. Inside a building once used by Al-Qaeda were some papers. They contained research on a new weapon of terror.
One of these documents spells out in very great detail how to make a dirty bomb. The understanding was basically at a fairly advanced physics level. It is a pretty well thought out scenario on how to make the most deadly kind of dirty bomb imaginable.
British intelligence recently reported that Al-Qaeda might have gone beyond the planning stage to actually build a dirty bomb in 1999.
Sources revealed that Osama bin Laden's top priority was to develop a weapon of mass destruction. The Taliban provided him with the medical isotopes needed for a radiological bomb, and that Al-Qaeda built a nuclear laboratory where they worked on a dirty bomb.
no one knows where it went or how powerful it might be. A dirty bomb can be tiny, maybe a single stick of dynamite. It's the radioactive heart, not the explosive, that matters most. Radioactivity comes from inside nature's tiniest building blocks. Some atoms of some elements are unstable, and that's where the danger lies. Every single atom can be thought of as a tiny solar system. Electrons orbit a nucleus made up of protons and neutrons. Because protons all carry a positive electrical charge, they repel each other. In most atoms, there are enough neutrally charged neutrons to balance them out and hold the atom together. But a radioactive atom is unbalanced. It will throw off or absorb particles until stability is achieved. Those subatomic particles and powerful rays of energy given off in the process are called radiation. Some radiation, such as gamma rays and X-rays, can pass right through solid substances, including the human body. If radiation pierces living tissue with enough energy, it can knock loose electrons from the molecules that make up our bodies. This ionization can trigger all sorts of damage to cells and to DNA, the software that controls cells. If the parts of DNA that control cell division become corrupted, the cell might mutate and multiply out of control, like these skin cancer cells. A potentially deadly malignant tumor is born. Much of what we know about the health effects of radiation comes from studying the atomic blasts in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those who survived suffered an elevated incidence of leukemia, breast, and other cancers years later. But most of them had been exposed to very high doses of radiation. What about low levels of radiation, as might come from a dirty bomb? Some say that any radiation, even tiny amounts, can cause cancer.
Radiation is a very strange thing because potentially a very small amount of radiation could lead to changes that, for example, could trigger cancer in the long term. All you really need for a disease such as cancer is for one cell to go wrong.
But other scientists disagree. And the epidemiology of cancer is tricky because cancer has so many causes.
It may take decades for cancer to appear, and then the probability that the cancer was caused by radiation instead of something else is so low that you just can't definitively say that this man's leukemia was caused by his occupational exposure to radiation, while this woman's leukemia was something that would have happened anyhow. There is no doubt that radiation can cause cancer. The doubt is what level of radiation it takes to cause cancer.
The scientific community in some respects is kind of all over the map. A few scientists would say there's a so-called hormesis effect, which means that for low levels of radiation, it's good for your health. So you have one extreme to another.
The risks of low-level radiation are fiercely debated, but there's no question that high levels are dangerous. So could terrorists get a powerful enough radioactive source to build an effective weapon? Dr. Abel Gonzalez is the world's first line of defense against the dirty bomb. As head of radiation security at the International Atomic Energy Agency, a bureau of the United Nations located in Austria, his task is to monitor all types of radioactive material around the globe. It is a much harder job than tracking weapons-grade material like plutonium.
Following Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was a big effort in the world to keep nuclear materials like plutonium and uranium very, very well under control. This has not happened with radioactive material, with low-grade material. Was not felt that this was needed. Everybody knew that you could not do a nuclear weapon with that. Therefore, why to have that control?
In December 2001, Gonzalez received troubling news. A situation had arisen that would ultimately show just how real the threat of a dirty bomb might be.
I received a telephone call from the head of my emergency unit saying to me, look, something is going on in Georgia.
Reports from this remote corner of the former Soviet Empire said that 2 men were in the hospital with terrible radiation burns. They had spent a night deep in the Georgian forest beside some small, warm metal canisters.
That was the first flash that we got that could be a serious problem of sources.
Unlike cancer, which takes years to develop, radiation sickness appears within hours after exposure to extremely high doses.
Radiation sickness has a number of features: hair loss, sickness, vomiting, and this is really because the cells in various organs in your body have sustained very high levels of radiation, damaging the DNA and other components of the cell to such a degree that those cells are actually dying. And if radiation sickness is bad enough, that leads to you dying as a human being.
What could have caused such injuries? Any source strong enough to produce radiation sickness like this must be very strong indeed.
I was convinced that my people either have drank too much vodka or that they have made a mistake, for we were absolutely convinced that was impossible that a source of such an amount of activity would exist.
An international task force was assembled to find out what had burned the woodcutters and to recover the radioactive sources before they could fall into the wrong hands.
The sources exist in regions of real political instability where we know that terrorist organizations operate. That really leads us to try to secure those as quickly as we can.
The 2 woodsmen said that they had encountered the metal canisters on a remote mountaintop, accessible only by a narrow dirt track. When the task force located the objects, they were lodged behind some rocks. Radiation detectors indicated that the cylinders contained concentrated strontium-90, which emits beta radiation. Beta radiation is a spray of fast-moving electrons that can pass through thin layers of material, including skin. When beta particles interact with matter, they generate an intense heat. Strontium-90 metal has been known to ignite spontaneously. The metal cylinders were hot enough to melt snow, and small wonder, because each one contained a substantial percentage of all the strontium spewed out across Europe during the Chernobyl accident.
For me, that was shocking, because I knew the amount of contamination that the Chernobyl accident has created.
The explosion of Chernobyl's nuclear power plant released huge amounts of strontium-90, iodine-131, and other radioisotopes, forcing the permanent evacuation of hundreds of square miles in the Ukraine. Scientists are still trying to calculate the full public health impact, especially far away from the initial blast, where radiation levels were low.
We have good data that a number of children, maybe most 2,000 children, developed thyroid cancer as a result of Chernobyl. But then when you try to look at how many leukemia cases arose from Chernobyl, it's still unclear how many there are. It happened in 1986, so it could take several more years, another decade or so, for some of these leukemia cases to show up.
To protect the recovery crew from direct exposure to this strontium-90, scientists calculated that no worker should spend more than 40 seconds near the canisters.
Good. Down a bit.
When the whistle blows, a replacement is sent in. It took 25 men working in these short shifts to secure the deadly canisters inside a lead-lined drum.
For me, were very nervous times until my people called me and said the source is secure.
Back in Vienna, Dr. Gonzalez scoured scientific literature, trying to find information about these powerful radioactive canisters. In an obscure Soviet manual dated 1983, he found plans for a kind of generator that could run for decades without refueling. Placed in remote locations, these canisters could power lighthouses and navigational beacons for airplanes. They were fueled by pure strontium-90, producing an internal temperature of over 800 degrees and converting that heat into electricity.
This was opening a Pandora box. What is all this about? How many we have of these? From where we can get information?
It quickly became clear that the Soviets had built thousands of these generators. It meant the ingredients for a dirty bomb were all over the former Soviet Union. Atomic Agency inspectors turned up other strange devices. Mounted on trucks, these objects were part of a vast and forgotten attempt to make Soviet farming more productive. Blasting seeds with radiation stopped them from germinating, allowing them to be stored longer. The substance that produced the radioactivity in these devices was cesium chloride. This material does not exist on Earth naturally. Humans create it in nuclear reactions.
Nuclear reactors produce a lot of cesium-137. That's a particularly dangerous material. It poses an external health hazard. It has a radioactive half-life of some 30 years, so it's around for a long period of time.
Cesium-137 emits gamma rays, packets of pure energy traveling at the speed of light, even through clothes and skin. And for anyone building a dirty bomb, cesium chloride has one other especially attractive feature.
Cesium chloride is really a talc powder, like a talc powder. Very, very, very dispersible.
Powdery material is exactly what a terrorist intent on contaminating a large area would want.
Do you know what happens in your home if you open a talc powder box? After a few hours, you will have talc all over your home.
UN investigators have established that the former Soviet Union is littered with forgotten cesium chloride. Unfortunately, no one knows whether any of it has already fallen into the wrong hands. So how much damage could a bomb using Soviet cesium chloride actually do? To find out, a team of scientists has devised a hypothetical dirty bomb scenario.
Factors that we have to consider are
the technical threshold here is much lower.
Nuclide is
the kind of challenge that we could be
what the explosion products.
Enviros is a British consulting firm that assesses environmental risks for governments and nuclear industries around the world. They have put together a model for a fictional explosion. The results were cross-checked by American experts.
Typical wind speed is about 10 kilometers an hour.
An obvious question is, what's the weather like?
In this fictional scenario, the dirty bomb contains 10 pounds of plastic explosives and 74,000 gigabecquerels of cesium chloride. That's the contents of just one Soviet seed irradiating device. Just a handful of powder, but highly concentrated. The target? Trafalgar Square, the traditional heart of London. The terrorists are driving the van. They're already suffering from the effects of radiation sickness. They didn't bother to shield themselves while handling the cesium that went into the bomb. But if we know one thing about Al-Qaeda, it's that the fear of death is no deterrent.
When a group is willing to die handling this kind of material, then there really aren't any limits on their ability to carry out a nightmare scenario.
The blast could kill perhaps 10 people immediately, including the terrorists. But the true threat of a dirty bomb lies in what would happen next.
The simple buoyancy of the air that's been heated by the explosion may carry the radioactive material perhaps tens of meters up into the air.
Loaded with billions of tiny radioactive particles, the heated air would very quickly begin to spread beyond Trafalgar Square.
If we're talking about wind speeds of meters per second, 5 meters per second perhaps, then to go 100 meters, that's 20 seconds. To go a kilometer, that's only a minute or so.
Within 2 minutes, the radioactive plume has traveled about 10 blocks, past government buildings to the Prime Minister's house. In another minute, it will cross the Thames River. It will take just half an hour for the cloud to reach London's suburbs, 6 miles east.
We've got contaminated air moving across a section of London, and in general, nobody would be aware that that contamination was there.
As the smoke cools, specks of dust and ash would lose their buoyancy and fall. The cesium chloride would bind with moisture in the air and with the falling particles. People on the ground would be unaware of the gathering danger around them. The good news is that there would be few immediate health problems. The radioactivity in this hypothetical dirty bomb would disperse so quickly that no one is likely to get a strong dose. Any radiation sickness, vomiting, burns, hair loss, like those Georgian woodcutters, is highly unlikely. Instead, Londoners will face a different problem, a long-term one: the radioactive contamination in varying degrees within their city. Particles will lodge between paving stones. Tiny amounts of cesium will remain in the grass and soil. Unless it's cleaned up, this radioactivity will stay in place for decades. The levels would be highest right at ground zero. Within 200 yards of the blast, radioactive contamination would reach 160 millisieverts per year.
We are really talking about very significant increases in radiation here. This is 80 times the normal background level of radiation.
When calculating the risks of radiation, scientists take as their starting point the natural background radiation we receive every day. From cosmic rays, from trace uranium under our feet, from potassium in the food we eat.
Right now, I've got my radiation meter turned on, and I'm just holding this out in air because it's measuring all of the radiation that's in this room from natural sources. Some of that is potassium-40 from the potassium in our bodies. 1/100% of potassium is naturally radioactive. That's the second largest source of background radiation for any of us. Radiation and radioactivity are part of our environment. We evolved to live with it.
Our bodies have natural defenses against radiation, but most scientists agree that levels 80 times higher than normal could easily overwhelm them. There is little controversy about levels of radiation this high. If the contaminated area is not cleaned up, anyone who stays could receive added damage to their DNA.
The problem that would arise would be that in the longer term, these people would have an increased risk of cancer due to that radiation exposure.
Every day spent in the target area could mean more DNA damage and more risk of cancer.
A very important thing to bear in mind about cancer is that it's a disease that evolves over time. And in order for a cell in your body to become fully cancerous, it's got to accumulate multiple mutations. Low levels of radiation over a considerable period of time can slowly, gradually cause those mutations to take place.
Using a standard formula, it is estimated that radiation levels of 80 times background could lead to 1 case of cancer for every 7 people who continued to live and work here. If the contamination were heavy enough, there might be a cancer time bomb ticking away in Trafalgar Square.
And I think it would be very difficult to justify individuals being exposed to that kind of additional risk on a day-to-day basis.
Under these circumstances, it's quite clear that the contamination would have to be cleaned up.
Cleaning up radioactive contamination is possible, but not easy. Abel Gonzalez watched the process firsthand 15 years ago. Brazilian scrap merchants stole a metal box from a hospital and got more than they bargained for. It contained a small amount of highly concentrated cesium chloride.
When they cut at the source and the powder got out, then the contamination problem started.
The radioactive dust was tracked throughout Goiânia. Nearly 200 people were exposed. 4 would die, including a 4-year-old girl who ate a sandwich after playing with the blue powder. She was buried in a lead coffin in a grave sealed in concrete. Pavements, squares, shops, and bars needed to be scrubbed and scraped. Contaminated soil had to be dug up and carted away. Some homes that couldn't be cleaned were taken away piece by piece. Decontamination took 6 months. But cleaning up the city created a whole new problem.
You don't get rid of radioactivity, you just transfer it to a different material. So whatever it was transferred to, whether it would be water or some kind of a cloth, would have to be disposed of still in the way we dispose of radioactive waste.
The Brazilian cleanup generated 6,500 cubic yards of radioactive rubbish.
The radioactive material that created the 5,000 cubic meter of waste was a capsule was this size, few centimeters.
Multiply this mess by 1,000 or 2 to get an idea of what would happen after an intentional release in London.
A dirty bomb incident using the same radioactive material would produce a much larger contaminated area and a much larger amount of waste, simply because in the Goiânia case, there wasn't even the intent to spread the material widely. In a dirty bomb, that would be precisely the point.
Our hypothetical dirty bomb would spew radioactive contamination over many square miles, far beyond Trafalgar Square. But as we move away from ground zero, the cesium particles from the dirty bomb would be more dispersed and the radiation levels lower. 3 miles from the blast, radiation levels would fall to just 50% above normal background. There is serious disagreement whether radiation levels this low would cause any health problems, and about how massive a cleanup effort would be warranted.
Right now, we just do not have definitive data to tell whether or not small levels of radiation are harmful, harmless, or beneficial. In the absence of that information, I think that it's maybe not good policy to be trying to reduce radiation levels to meet a risk when we don't even know where the starting point is.
But current international safety standards are designed to save lives at any cost. They are based on the cautious assumption that even tiny amounts of radiation can cause cancer. Those standards would require much of London to be decontaminated. And that's not all.
In some cases, either the cost or the technical barriers will be prohibitive to decontaminating an area. And if people aren't willing to accept the radioactivity in that area, the only feasible option will be to abandon that space. It seems ridiculous to think that we might demolish or abandon chunks of a city. But in some cases, it may simply be that that will become our choice. That will become our preferred approach.
In the aftermath of a dirty bomb attack, on television the next day, it's going to be non-stop contentious debate. You're going to have scientists and experts on both sides of the issue. One side saying that if it's low-level contamination, we might not have to actually tear down buildings as maybe the guidelines would recommend us doing. And other people are going to say, yes, we got to follow these strict guidelines. We need to tear down the buildings. And you're going to have people in between trying to sort this out, trying to weigh the cost versus the benefits.
In the United States, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is one of the agencies that sets the guidelines.
The reality is I think there has to be some balance of costs and benefits. And I think you could set some guidelines for the decision, but I think it would be inevitable that in the real-world situation that you'd have to have some flexibility to exist as the conditions as you find them. If you were to discover that the costs to reach a particular cleanup level were truly extraordinary, you may well conclude, well, we'll explore some other option.
But let's imagine a dirty bomb event occurs, say, tomorrow, and then the government says, well, now we're going to change the guidelines. And I can imagine the public would cry foul and saying, wait a minute, you're moving the goalpost on us, and now you're saying, oh, no, we don't want to spend that kind of money actually cleaning things up. One thing we need to do is to have this debate now before there's any kind of dirty bomb event to see if we can perhaps reach some consensus. I don't know if consensus is possible at this stage, but I think a debate, a dialogue is always healthy.
We have found it very hard to have rational discussions about nuclear materials.
Demoralizing, divisive debates in the aftermath of a dirty bomb will only work to the terrorists' advantage. Perhaps the best way to keep this scenario from becoming reality is to keep radioactive material out of the hands of those who mean us harm. The American government is starting to work on the problem. U.S. borders are watched more closely now than last year. Ships are being searched, and sophisticated detection equipment is being installed in some ports and other entry points. But not all radioactive material comes from outside the country. There's plenty of it right here.
It's not just Russia, let's put it that way. I mean, we certainly have responsibilities and problems in our backyard.
812, I'm Britt Whitmire, and you're listening to the Murphy in the Morning Show on 107.5 KZL.
In March 1998, the people of Greensboro, North Carolina woke up to what they thought was a perfectly normal spring day.
43 Greensboro, 43 Winston-Salem, it's 44 in High Point.
Tim Rice, CEO of a general hospital here, set off for work with a busy schedule of meetings ahead of him. But it got busier than he ever could have imagined.
I got interrupted from this meeting that I was in, and so I knew it was something important. One of my physician colleagues said, Tim, the cesium's missing. And I kind of had to sit there and scratch my head and thought, what is the cesium? What do we use it for? Is this a real big deal? And as I could hear in his voice, he was very concerned and very disturbed. And that was my first inkling that I've got a problem here. And from there on, things started to really roll quickly.
The missing cesium was inside 19 tiny metal containers called brachytherapy needles. These needles are inserted into tumors. Because doctors know that radiation can kill cells, they focus its destructive power directly onto cancer cells.
The amount of radioactivity involved certainly was significant. 22 gigabecquerels has the potential to give someone a fairly substantial radiation exposure.
We were trying not to frighten people, but we were walking around the facilities with Geiger counters. We were going room by room through the basements, through the crawl spaces, just everywhere we could think of that it could be.
We surveyed the main sewer lines running out of the hospital, and then we began to branch out from there.
Department of Energy helicopters were called in. They employed special devices capable of sensing tiny amounts of radioactivity, even inside buildings or cars.
We had the aerial monitoring, flying low, checking out the remainder of the city, the wastewater treatment plants, the landfills. We had everything but boats.
The Greensboro Hospital's cesium needles were never recovered. But the experience has led to an entirely new attitude towards security.
At the time of this theft, and I'm saying theft because I presume that's what it was, we were securing this in order to protect employees or anyone from inadvertently being exposed to this radioactive material. After that point, we completely changed our mentality about all of our nuclear substances and secured them in a fashion to protect anyone from being able to steal them. Today, people ask me, how is it stored? And I won't tell them.
The missing brachytherapy needles from Moses Cone Hospital have joined 30,000 other items on a list of radiation sources now lost inside the U.S.
One of the paradoxes in this situation we find ourselves in now is that we're surrounded by these sources. We need them. You can't take an X-ray without radiation.
Ironically, we're relying on radiation more now, a result of increased security. One source is the X-ray tubes used to screen luggage at airports, but these only generate radiation when they're plugged in. Because radiation can destroy microbes, the U.S. Postal Service is now employing gamma rays to kill anthrax and other dangerous biological weapons that might be lurking in the mail. This same technology has already been used for killing germs in many consumer items.
Many states now have irradiation facilities for sterilizing products, whether it's a Band-Aid, whether it's food. We're becoming, if anything, more dependent on these things in our daily lives.
It's estimated in the United States alone, there are some 2 million radioactive sources. But we need to realize that only a small fraction of those, maybe on the order of a couple 100,000, would actually present high security risk.
Local and federal authorities are now trying harder to track radioactive material that might pose a dirty bomb threat. New instruments are being employed to detect radioactivity inside trucks on the nation's highways. Detection devices have also been quietly installed at certain entry points into our major cities.
We found in talking to doctors around New York City that they're starting to hear stories from cancer patients who had treatments that involve radiation implantation, that kind of thing. So they're slightly radioactive. Slightly, ever so slightly. And there was a car stopped coming in through one of the tunnels into the city just a month ago because the police detected radiation in the car, and it was a woman who had recently had a cancer treatment. We're watching. The police are monitoring tunnels for traces of radioactivity.
Detectors are also installed in many scrapyards. That's how authorities found this industrial gauge that had been thrown in the trash.
They are used in industrial settings for measuring densities of materials or levels of liquids or other materials in tanks, for determining whether or not the right number of cans is in a case, those sorts of things.
Such gauges commonly contain cesium chloride powder, but 1,000 times less than a Soviet seed irradiating device. How much damage could such a small amount of radioactive material cause? Our scientists have constructed another hypothetical scenario to find out. In this fictional scenario, the terrorists simply mix the small amount of cesium found inside the industrial gauge with powder from a store-bought firework. The target is Washington, D.C.'s metro, used by 500,000 commuters every day. There is a small flash beside the track in one of the tunnels as the mixture ignites. Almost immediately, a highly effective dispersal mechanism is at work. The trains. They push radioactive particles down the track towards commuters.
There won't be any immediate signs that the dispersal of radioactive materials has occurred. We can't see or hear or taste them.
But the cesium particles would quietly continue to spread. Radioactive dust would enter subway cars as the doors open.
People could track them on their feet, underneath their shoes. Trains could move them actively between stations.
While some particles would be carried on to the next stop, others would move out of the station via the metro's ventilation system. How much of a health threat would this pose? The typical commuter would receive twice the background dose they get in the course of an average year, but only for a short period, an average of 15 minutes. That translates into a small increase in their cancer risk, just 1 in 4,000 by standard conservative estimates.
Individual riders are unlikely to be affected even if the material remains there for several hours without being disclosed, simply because any one person doesn't spend all that much time in the station.
But it might be worse for the staff. After an 8-hour shift, their cancer risk could rise by 1 in 100.
They would have to be carefully monitored, and I'm sure they'd actually want to be monitored for a considerable period afterwards.
Scientists agree that these health risks are manageable, but the psychological factor may be another story.
Authorities said they were urgently trying to establish the scope of radioactive scale of radioactive contamination. Senate staffers who travel into the city by metro threat of further dirty bomb attack.
Echoed the "Stay put, don't panic" message.
When news of the attack breaks, people in Washington, D.C. would be desperate to know the extent of the contamination.
The news media comes on and says a small device has exploded in Washington. What is the reaction of the populace? How do you control that? What do you say to them? Do you say a lot? Do you say very little?
Officials stressed the need for calm.
I think initially people would get the hell out. Emergency workers would have to deal with a real peril from just panic. And that's something that presumably, or hopefully, city emergency planners are working on right now, is how do you deal with that?
You probably have more deaths due to traffic accidents than you would from ionizing radiation.
It could be hard for authorities to provide answers as fast as people want. Contamination could be patchy, high in some parts of the metro, low in others, making it difficult to be sure immediately how serious the attack had been.
It may be unclear for perhaps some period of time exactly what the radioactivity was, how much there was of it.
And that short period of uncertainty could be enough to fuel our fears.
The purpose of a dirty bomb will be to terrorize people. And the reason why people will be terrorized will be because they think that an incredibly small amount of radiation can give you cancer.
I don't know that many people would make the distinctions between a small radioactive source and a larger radioactive source. Those distinctions may be totally lost on the population. So for that reason, even the smallest of radioactive sources, if used in a dirty bomb scenario, could be very disruptive.
The cesium chloride released in Brazil was an amount similar to that in our subway scenario, enough to fill a cigarette lighter. But crowds of fearful residents took to the streets.
This became a soup of panic.
More than 100,000 people, 10% of the city's population, filled a stadium and demanded radiation screening.
Everybody wants to be monitored. Even if you say to them, don't worry, you were very far away, there is no chance. No, I want to be monitored.
Apparently the press kind of inflamed some fears. They convinced some of the public that the water supplies were perhaps contaminated. Turns out they likely were not. And so that led to even more people wanting to be monitored.
It turned out that only 200 people had been exposed, but hospitals and clinics were still swamped. American experts are now trying to draw lessons from Brazil to help us prepare for the repercussions of even a small dirty bomb.
10% of the city's population demanded screening for exposure to radiation. Those kinds of things are likely to overwhelm our public health system. If 10% of Washington shows up at the hospital, you got some things to confront.
Current U.S. regulations would require a thorough decontamination of metro stations, tunnels, and trains to make them safe for employees and to calm public fears.
We would shut down the subway in order to carry out the cleanup, and that would result in massive inconveniences and economic losses. Tourism could be affected, trade could be affected. The losses could drive into the tens or hundreds of billions of dollars.
Maybe this is the real threat from a dirty bomb. It may hurt few, if any. If cleaned up, it may not cause a single case of cancer. It is not a weapon of mass destruction, but it would still frighten us and cost us lots of money. And that makes it an attractive tool of terror.
Radiological terrorism can leverage public fear of radiation to take what would normally be considered a very small amount of radioactive material, something not all that dangerous, and turn it into a weapon that can have massive psychological and economic impact.
A dirty bomb is, above all, a psychological weapon. But can we use that knowledge to avoid panic and to plan for the attack that may lie in our future?
One of the important things that I recognize in this job at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is the reality that people are afraid of things nuclear. That means that we have to make an effort to deal with the reality that the public has those concerns and try to make sure that our processes are as open as possible and that the reasons for our decisions are made available to the public so that there isn't a concern that decisions that are adversely affect people are made behind closed doors.
We as a society should be trying to educate each other. And the more we can kind of go through that thought exercise now, the better off we'll be when something happens. And inevitably something will happen, whether it's radiological, biological, chemical, something will happen.
What is the U.S. doing to protect itself against this threat? On NOVA's website, hear what one of the nation's leading experts on nuclear terrorism has to say at pbs.org or America Online keyword PBS. To order this show or any other NOVA program for $19.95 plus shipping and handling, call WGBH Boston Video at 1-800-255-9424. is a production of WGBH Boston. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Park Foundation, dedicated to education and quality television.
Science. It's given us the framework to help make wireless communications clear. Sprint is proud to support NOVA.
We see an explorer. At Microsoft, your potential inspires us to create software that helps you reach it. Your potential, our passion.
And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
I am PBS.